Reminder, today's conference.
Welcome to Part 2 of our webinar series on reducing the risk of SIDS in early childhood. In this webinar, we are very pleased to share the expertise of Mark Mendel, Divisional Vice President, Bright Horizons, Linda Whitehead, PhD, Vice President, Education and Training, Bright Horizons, and my name is Helen Zaba, and I will be moderating this webinar. Here is what we will be covering today. First, we will be doing a quick review of Part 1 of this webinar series. Then we will be discussing Bright Horizons policies and procedures for safe sleep practices, talking to families about their concerns, SIDS educational materials and resources, guidelines to handle a medical emergency involving an infant. I'm now very happy to pass over to Linda Whitehead.
Thank you, Helen. I'd like to quickly review what was covered in Part 1. Babies should always be placed to sleep on their backs. Nothing else should be in the crib with a baby under 12 months. And supervised tummy time is crucial for a baby's physical development. In Part 1, you heard from Dr. Moon about the research behind safe sleep practices and recommendations for daily interactions with babies regarding sleep policies. Now I'd like to specifically review Bright Horizons policies and procedures. All infants are to be placed to sleep on their back, except where parents have completed a signed authorization from both the parents and the child's pediatrician. Some states allow no exceptions, but if you are in a state that does, the release must be signed by both parents and the physician and available in the child's file. Sometimes caregivers ask what they should do if they place a child to sleep on her back and she rolls to her front. As long as you first place the child on her back, you do not need to reposition the child onto her back again if she rolls. In fact, repositioning is not recommended. I'd like to next talk about the infant sleep checks. It's our policy that when children are sleeping, at least one caregiver in a room needs to position herself so that she can see sleeping children at all times with only slight changes of position. If a child needs a diaper change, for example, and that requires the staff member watching the sleeping babies to move to a different position, staff members should talk with each other and decide which caregiver makes the most sense to do the diaper change. We want you to be sensitive to your interactions with the awake babies as well, of course. In addition, teachers need to physically check sleeping infants, toddlers, and twos by standing near their crib or mat and looking directly at them every 20 minutes. If your center already does this more often, keep that up and don't change your practice. Checking on a child, though, should not disturb the child's sleep. And we always want you to note this on the infant sleep check form. I'd like to talk next about what is appropriate to have in a crib. For children 12 months and younger, pillows, quilts, comforters, sheepskins, stuffed toys, bumper pads, or any other soft toys are not allowed. This is to prevent children becoming entangled in blankets or moving themselves during sleep against the bumpers and having that affect their breathing. Dr. Moon, as you'll remember, discussed this in Part 1 of the webinar. However, with a signed release from parents, a blanket or soft toy can be used. Sleep sacks are recommended as an alternative, and you only need a release for a sleep sack if it's provided by the center. We never allow pillows. An upcoming slide will show how a thin blanket can be used to tuck in a child. The blanket is tucked in under the mattress. Even in this circumstance, a release is required from parents. Mark?
Thank you, Linda. As we know, many parents bring into our centers favorite toys or sometimes thick comforters for use in our cribs. But as Linda mentioned, at Bright Horizons we have a policy against such practices. We're not going to have toys or thick comforters in our cribs. These two photos clearly show how a baby should be placed in a crib to sleep at night, or particularly while at one of our centers. Photo number 1 shows a baby on his or her back in a comfortable light sleeper, or we could use, of course, a sleep sack. Photo number 2 shows also a suitable method. It's often called the feet-to-foot method. This is when babies' feet are down next to the foot of the crib, and a light blanket is tucked on 3 sides.
Thanks, Mark. So the last of the policies that I'd like to discuss with you is our policy on supervised tummy time. Again, you heard a little bit about this in part 1 of the webinar. One unintended consequence of placing babies to sleep on their backs is that many babies are getting less time on their tummies. Tummy time is crucial for babies to develop strength in their upper bodies. We recommend that you start out with a baby with short times on his tummy, perhaps only about 3 to 5 minutes. Babies who get used to lying on their backs initially may not like the tummy position, so that's the reason for starting out with small time periods initially. You or your coworkers should be sitting on the floor next to any babies on their tummies, hence the term supervised tummy time. If a baby falls asleep while on his tummy, move him to the crib and lay him down on his back in the crib as soon as possible. Mark?
So we certainly have policies that clearly state that all infants should be placed on their backs to sleep. Our policy on infant sleep position and crib furnishings is referenced throughout this training, and it's available on BrightWeb. You should definitely read it and become familiar with it. Even with our policy, some parents will come to us and want their babies to be put to sleep on their tummy or side or with rolled-up blankets or wedges. Remember, at Bright Horizons, we value our partnerships with parents in caring for their children. However, we know that this is an unsafe thing to do and puts babies at risk. We all recognize that it might be uncomfortable for you as a teacher to tell parents that our policy is to place babies back to sleep, but we are asking you to do this. And so, if you're uncomfortable, practice the words with your supervisor. Practice it with a coworker or your director. Role play the parent perspective and how you can be a good parent educator and partner to them. Early on at your first meeting with parents of a new baby that's registering at your center, you should talk about the Bright Horizons Back to Sleep policy and reducing the risk of SIDS. It's a great tool to use during the conversation. Use the policy. Talk about the policy. We also have the Back to Sleep brochures available to give parents as well. One way to engage the parent is to ask, so what position does your baby sleep at home? If the baby sleeps on his or her tummy, it allows for a good opportunity to listen and partner with parents to talk to them about back to sleep. Sometimes during this conversation, a parent still prefers an alternate sleep position. In our spirit of why not attitude and the HEART principles, it's a great time to ask if there's a medical reason why the baby needs to sleep in a position other than on his or her back. Remember, as partners, there may be a medical reason. If so, Bright Horizons has a special form that has to be completed by the parents and the child's physician. But if there's no medical reason, you can feel free to simply explain how back to sleep reduces the risk of SIDS and courteously remind the parents that it is our policy. If at any point you continue to feel uncomfortable with this conversation with a parent, ask your director to talk to the parents. If there's a medical reason and we do get a physician's note, be sure the note is dated and signed by the pediatrician. This note will be attached to the signed parent release on infant sleep position and sleeping devices form. So if the note comes directly to you as an infant nursery teacher, please let your director know about the note right away. Your director should be made aware because there may be a medical condition that's important for she or he to be aware of. We strongly recommend that all caregivers and substitutes in a center that might be caring for this baby have a conference and a meeting to understand the medical reason why this baby must be placed on their side or tummy or any other recommendations by the pediatrician. Since our standard is to place a baby back to sleep, please post a note in the crib of any child that should be positioned differently. So just a short review. We are partners with the parents and guardians of children in our care. Especially for the parents of babies, we are also parent educators. We should always be prepared to give explanations, not orders, especially when it surrounds the health and well-being of these babies. Therefore, discussions around SIDS and safe sleep practices are very important. Parents should understand the ways to reduce risk, not only for when the baby is at Bright Horizons, but also at home. Finally, we need to also understand that there may be some extenuating medical reasons for a different sleep position, and that we honor the parents' wishes if they bring a note from the pediatrician. Even with all the preventive measures that we've talked about in these two sessions and in this webinar, babies still die of SIDS. Through awareness and training, the number of deaths have dropped dramatically, as Dr. Moon referred to, but over 2,000 infants die of SIDS each year. Most SIDS deaths happen because babies are placed on their side or tummy to sleep, and some because of unsupervised tummy time. Over 20% of SIDS deaths happen in a child care setting. Every caregiver, every teacher, every floater, substitute, and director, clearly every employee at a Bright Horizons Center should be prepared for a medical emergency. As you probably already know, all of our staff are encouraged or required to be trained in emergency first aid and infant-child CPR. Hopefully, you'll never need to use it, but if you do, you need to be prepared. Emergency numbers should be posted by each telephone. If your center has a written emergency plan or checklist, post it in a visible spot on the wall or near the crib area. All teachers and caregivers, including substitutes, should know their center-specific emergency procedures. You should know how to react quickly, who to call, how to care for both the child with the emergency, but also the rest of the children in your group. This is the end of part 2 of this webinar training. You should now be familiar with how to reduce the risk of SIDS, especially in our centers, but also in home settings. You should be knowledgeable about the Bright Horizons policies on sleep position and infant crib furnishings, as well as our policy on supervised tummy time. If we follow our policies and educate parents so that they understand their role at home, we can reduce the risk of SIDS. If you're interested in more information, here are 4 organizations and websites that you may wish to visit. Finally, here's the contact information and website for First Candle, the co-sponsor of this webinar. Thank you for participating in this Bright Horizons Safe Sleep webinar.